Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. And in this particular video, I want to talk about several things that Creative Assembly should look at to change or improve on the campaign map. Various races, various features, various issues to deal with. Now that they do have a dedicated team, and they do seem to be doing quite a bit with patch 5.2. We'll see exactly what kind of changes there will be. But keep in mind, a lot of the issues that certain races, certain legendary lords do have can be rather easily fixed. In fact, there are modders with no experience in modding that have been able to address quite a lot of significant issues, like think of Kislev, for instance. So anyway, starting this off, let's talk about sieges. I mean, we can talk about Cafe, how Cafe really does need a more interesting playstyle, because one of the things I would say about the game in general is that, yes, there's a nice toolbox out there for a lot of races, but in a lot of campaigns we don't use it because it takes so long to get it that by the time we can even mass those troops or recruit those troops actually in the first place, the campaign is kind of like at the point where we've effectively won. And that's something that Creative Assembly should worry about going forward. I mean, there's campaign customization mods that do help with this immensely. And I do feel like campaign customization in general is something that they should invest more effort. Like, let me start a campaign at higher level. Let me start with more resources. Let me start with more growth. Let me start with higher ranked generals so I can get the ball rolling and actually have more interesting gameplay. That is my perspective on that. But anyway, let's mention sieges. One of the brilliant things that the Pharaoh team, the Sophia team, did with respect to sieges in Pharaoh, not in Troy, but in Pharaoh and Pharaoh dynasties, is that while you do have to build siege equipment to attack a settlement, it's actually quite worthwhile to do so, because every bit of siege equipment that you build will increase your Autoresolve chance. So the more siege equipment you have, the better off you'll be. That is a really, really great system that the CA Sophia team developed over there. Also, they do have a bar showing you what chances you have, right? What unit? They also show you what units get wiped out and all that. But it would be better than just having like a buried victory or something like that, right? Having that bar, which Rome 2 and many other games did have, and I think like I want that bar back in Warhammer 3 because I kind of want to know what type of victory it would be, but I also want to know what that bar is showing, because sometimes you do get some very tight victories. I mean, it's very important to know if units are going to get wiped out, all that. It will also be great to know like how many casualties we're going to take. Like, say what you will about Rome 2, they did provide that information. But with respect to sieges in particular, one of the things I would say about sieges is that in Pharaoh and in dynasties, the more siege equipment you build when you're besieging a settlement, the better your Autoresolve, which makes sense. I mean, it's supposed to help you out. One of the problems I feel like with Warhammer 3 that exists is that you build siege equipment, you besiege a settlement, but until like 6, 7, 8 turns pass, you're not really going to feel the impact. And this is not just something that you, as the player, have to deal with. It's also something the AI has to deal with. And something you can abuse as a player, because in a lot of cases, the vast majority of cases, when the AI besieges a walled settlement, they're going to spend many, many turns trying to do it, if they even attack it in the first place. So that kind of dynamic is not great, as opposed to dynasties, where every bit of individual siege equipment does significantly impact the Autoresolve. We should also talk about the Autoresolve that settlements inherently have as a benefit, which is plain bullshit as far as I see it. So maybe that should be removed. There are mods that already remove it, and I can tell you, like, if there's any particular concern, it's going to make the campaign too easy, or it's going to make the AI break. I've played a lot of campaigns without it. The AI is perfectly fine with that situation. In fact, I think they benefit because you as a player know when you're going to lose units, and you will play the battle manually to not lose those units. The AI thinks, oh, I'm going to win. Doesn't matter if I lose a couple of units. That actually weakens the AI and stalls their progression, because they're constantly losing units in Autoresolve against each other, not necessarily against you. So you actually end up seeing better and bigger AI empires in a campaign where you remove the Autoresolve from settlements. Just something worth considering on that. And if we're also talking on the subject of sieges, all the buildables, except like walls would be fine if they're built at the beginning of the battle, not throughout the battle, but the freaking towers need to go. Like, I understand the intent behind it. You had demonic races with no range. It was, like, I feel it was designed to try and tackle that. And also the survival battles in Realms of Chaos. But like many ideas from Realms of Chaos, it didn't work out. So, to hell with that system. It's not a great system. It does absolutely nothing for the battles. The buildable barricades, sure, it's fine. It was, especially now that you can permanently destroy them. But initially, it wasn't great, and just having barricades pop out of nowhere is not great either. So just overall, not a great system there as well. Like, there's a lot of things to talk about Siege's pathfinding issues that are exacerbated by all the buildable things. Like, it's actually better if you had to choose, if you or they had to choose, okay, I'm going to build these at the beginning of the battle, and that's it, right? I can't build more. We shall prevail. That would just be a perspective on that. The second thing I really want to talk about is AI scalability in a campaign. See, one of the problems with the way that difficulty has been handled in Total War is that when you're playing a campaign on any difficulty except easy, the AI gets a certain number of benefits to make up for its inherent weaknesses. I mean, there's suggestions that they don't make the AI too intelligent, because obviously if the AI was too intelligent, people would get completely crushed. It would be nice to actually be crushed a lot more often. But here's the problem. You have the AI starting with a certain number of benefits, things like growth, upkeep benefits, money, so on and so forth, line of sight. Problem is that those benefits are static throughout the entire campaign. So once you overcome like the turn 20, 30 rush, if you will, you're not going to experience any kind of challenge, or the challenge that you will experience will be inherently less than the challenge that you experienced at the beginning of your campaign, which is something that ruins the end game because the AI is obviously not able to keep up with you. Especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty where by necessity you are forced to learn to play game, play high progressive to survive the initial challenge. But once you survive that, there's nothing more to it because any other challenge has been removed completely because the AI just stays static. So one of the things I really feel CA should do, not endgame crises, not end game events or anything like that. Like, we can talk about the Mongols, we can talk about the Huns, we can talk about Warriors Chaos. It's never worked, ever. See peoples at no point. Because one of the things we care about in Total War is dynamic campaign gameplay. When you just spawn cheap AI armies or free AI armies for the AI, it breaks the game. Like, it's inherently a broken system. So what I think would be much better is as you're progressing through the campaign, as you pass certain turns, the AI gets stronger and stronger benefits, like experience for their units, experience for their generals leveling up. It shouldn't be so obvious, but it should happen. Like, maybe, minor benefits every 5 turns or so. Very minor benefits, but stacking up for the course of a campaign. So by the midpoint, you're still being challenged. By the end game, you're still being challenged by the AI. I think that would add a lot more variety to a campaign, make things a lot more interesting, make things more dynamic, and actually push the player towards enjoying a longer campaign and having to worry about different things than what we do right now. I've played with campaign customization where I give the AI, where I give everyone, including myself, like higher ranked generals, and I can tell you this much. When you give the AI higher ranked generals, it changes the game completely because skill lines, all that. So I can tell you, like, it's actually been a challenge fighting some of those factions are very, very different because I can't assume a low-tier army, which, by the way, is what happens in the vanilla game. You play with, like, low-tier armies unless, like, there's a particular challenge, like, Archeon with Regiments Renown. You play with low-tier armies and you defeat what is in your path. But when the AI has better benefits, not at the beginning, but the mid-game, late game, you have to worry about, they're going to send higher tier units. They're going to have generals that are going to actually matter in battle, like generic generals, not just their legendary lords. Those kind of things do create a better experience. Something modding can already provide, but should be a baseline addition to the game, from my perspective with respect to that. So just in general, like, the idea of scalability for a campaign would be great. Maybe as an option, added to more campaign customization I could add in Warhammer 3. The third thing to talk about is with regards to the Autoresolve in general, not just sieges, and also with regards to replenishment, because these two things go hand in hand. Take, for instance, Slaanesh. Slaanesh is a really powerful faction. I don't think anyone doubts that the demons of Slaanesh are really, really strong and can get the job done. But here's the problem with Slaanesh. Slaanesh has one of the worst auto-resolves, at least with the inherent units of Slaanesh. I'm not talking about Champions of Chaos units, but just the baseline Slaanesh units, has some of the worst auto-resolve in the game. But on top of that, a lot of the units that Slaanesh does have very low armor, so inherently they're going to take damage. Now, this is not necessarily a problem when you're actually fighting a battle yourself manually, because you do know how to deal with it. But here's the problem. When you force a player to have to fight every single meaningless battle, it is not a fun experience. But even worse for Slaanesh, they have really poor replenishment and limited recruitment slots. Everything goes hand in hand. Like, people talk about racial variety. Oh, some races should be weaker in this respect. Yeah, fair enough. Variety is important. I make this point a lot. But not with systems. You can't have variety when everyone is using the same systems. Everyone has to deal with Autoresolve. Everyone has to deal with recruitment. Everyone has to deal with replenishment in more or less the same way, with the exception of like what races like the Warriors of Chaos. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. So, or Nurgle. So it is important that races do work on a similar level or have a good enough baseline that they can handle it. Not some races are complete rubbish and others are kings of the hill. You can have some races better at it than others, like for instance Kislev has an enormous amount of casualty replenishment as an example. Or Warriors of Chaos have a auto-resolve so ridiculous that you can auto-resolve their entire campaign. But point is, when everyone's dealing with the same systems, you gotta make sure that the way you balance those systems makes sense. Slaanesh doesn't have a way of increasing casualty replenishment. They don't have an easy way without DLC of getting a good auto-resolve. And even with the DLC, even with those really powerful units, the real problem that's going to cause is that, yeah, you can recruit a bunch of, Warriors of Chaos in your campaign as Slaanesh, but the problem is you're just going to recruit Warriors of Chaos and heroes. So your variety goes out the window. That is, by the way, a problem. It was a problem with the dwarves before Thrones Decay, where basically Quarrelers and Grudge Throwers were the best thing you could ever recruit. Now, it's like I barely use Grudge Throwers or Quarrelers in a Dwarven campaign just because of how how much improved the dwarves are. Like, I still get some Quarrelers, Grudge Throwers only if I can't get access to cannons, but, things like Iron Drakes, Thunderers, lower tier Gyrocopters, like, the game has changed there completely. But one of the reasons dwarves work much better is because they had a really good auto-resolve, but now they have really good casualty replenishment, so you can play around with the units in the race far more. You can make Slayer armies, you can make pure melee armies, you can make flamethrower armies, flying armies, Apache helicopter armies. It's quite very strong and very fun, as opposed to like just recruiting one unit or two units and just using those. For Khorne, it's again Warriors of Chaos. For Siege, it's the same thing, along with Sangors. For Nurgle, same thing. Like, that is one of the problems when we're all having to deal with the system, but some just trivialize it, whereas others struggle with it inherently. And it's not because it's a challenge. It is not a challenge. It is just like something that requires a solution that is dull as dirt. That is the problem there. So casualty replenishment, auto-resolve needs to be improved, and it needs to work better across the board. Also, research trees. Like, some research trees are really great. Chaos dwarves, for instance. But other research trees are just filled with useless trash, and where you're just wasting time, really, to get very meaningless benefits for the most part. Or you research a lot of things to get one useful benefit in your campaign. So yeah, research trees in general do need to be improved. So those kind of aspects, like replenishment, auto-resolve, unit recruitment, and research trees, all of them do need some major improvements in the game. Or at the very least, the races that don't have them in a great spot do genuinely need them to be better. Now we're gonna get a Khorne DLC, so Khorne is probably out of the woods. Nurgle is in a much better state, though I think there's some discussion to be had about, like, you know, how many infections we have, and using the same resource for buildings as you use for certain specific research and plagues. That could be improved. But all the same, like, Nurgle, much better spot. Siege does need help, and I imagine we're also going to get this nice DLC, which is probably going to affect the High Elves and Dark Elves at the same time. Which, yeah, High Elves do need some improvements in this respect as well. Fourth on the list are objectives. Short campaign victory conditions, long campaign victory conditions, and just quests in general, or just objectives to aim for, various things to aim for during the course of a campaign. One of the things that's actually missing in Warhammer 3, as opposed to what we had in the past, is we no longer have chapters for a campaign, which would give you some money for various objectives which you completed. So there were things that you do very early on in a campaign, and then there were things you do in the mid-game, in the late game, and so on, culminating in short campaign and long campaign victories. This is obviously missing in Warhammer 3. But it's more than just that. It's also just having objectives that you can complete in a campaign. And I'm not talking about the missions that we do have over here, because yes, there are a lot of missions potentially available during the course of a campaign. But one of the things that makes dwarves so great, and one of the best races to play in the game right now, and one of the things that makes Malachi so great to play right now in the game, is all the objectives you do have in a campaign, which adds immense level of replayability, be it for the Great Book of Grudges, where you do want to do various objectives in order to get all the benefits you do have, like restoring the Underway, or a landmark involves Anvil, or calling the miners, and so on and so forth. So very significant benefits from that. And with Malachi, like, his entire unique campaign system of Malachi's adventures, which are really the Gotrek and Felix adventures, more or less, is also such a phenomenal system, because again, it adds so much replayability. Like, initially when I started playing this campaign, when I got my hands on Friends Decay, I, like many other people, went for cannons, but then I realized, hold on a second, gyrocopters are freaking awesome and powerful and strong and easily available, so why not go for those? And the brilliant thing here is that you do get various quests, various objectives to complete by going through those adventures. So it adds an immense amount of replayability, far more so than any other campaign in the game. Now, mind you, when we're talking about objectives and various quests and all that, it can be very poorly thought out. Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 for items was not great. Still isn't. We've also seen with Warhammer 3 how a campaign like the Changeling can collapse in on its own face when it's just based purely on completing grindy objectives. The great thing about Malachi's objectives and the Dwarven objectives in general is that you're doing things you would want to do naturally. You're playing the game, basically, and doing a couple of things on the side as well that are not interfering with your main campaign objective, which is to secure victory. One of the problems with the Realms of Chaos, the rifts in the Realms of Chaos, is that they would take away from conquering territory, establishing world empire. Not just because of the rift spawning, but because you'd be sending your main army into the Realms of Chaos, and it would not be available for a very long time. This is one of the things that CA has done so well for Malachi. And obviously, I'm not saying every campaign should be like this. What I am saying is that having a well-implemented objective system in campaigns can add so much to the game's experience. That is what I'm saying over here. And yeah, I do certainly hope that CA is taking copious notes about what really worked with Thrones of Decay and why. That would be my perspective on it. Finally, we gotta talk about racial balancing in general. I'm not talking here just about like things like replenishment or how many recruitment slots or research, though all of those would be part of it, but also campaign systems. As an example, Bretonnia and Warhammer 3, while it's a very powerful race from an economic perspective and they have really great cavalry, it's not really great to play because they lack the infantry to really make it work, and not having infantry or good range does hurt you a lot in Warhammer 3. Just relying purely on cavalry, melee cavalry, that doesn't really work very well. I mean, the flying cavalry does help out some ways, but yeah, things like vows, research do need to be improved. As do races like Kislev, for instance, because Kislev can work very well as a race. They have a strong unit roster that is available, especially with the additions of Shadows of Change. If you did buy that DLC, a lot of people didn't. But you do get very powerful units. Things like Akshinas are pretty strong, Hag Witches, all that. But in reality, the problem with a race like Kislev, as is the problem with other races, you're almost never going to see that. Like, you look at Kafea, it's like, oh, Kafea has great kit. Yeah, you know what? You use in a Kafea campaign, you use Jade Warriors all around, and Jade Warrior Crossbowmen. So a couple of melee Jade Warriors initially, then Jade Warrior Crossbowmen, if you don't start the ability of recruiting crossbows from the very beginning, and then maybe some Halberdiers, and eventually some artillery. But that's a campaign, a Kafean campaign. And it plays out in a very similar manner across the freaking board. That is not a great situation. What's worse for a race like Kislev, or if we're thinking about the Bretonnian research, or how long it takes for the High Elves to get their hero capacity, is that these systems really limit your campaign potential and reduce the variety you do have in a campaign and how dynamic campaigns can be. Being able to recruit more units, or a wider variety of units, is a great thing. We could talk about how, like, more races could use the Warband upgrade system, or some variant, some lesser variant. Not as powerful as the actual Warriors of Chaos, but, like, yeah, it would be great to have some variety over there, or just being able to upgrade a unit to a higher tier, even if you can't, change it at that point. Would make things more interesting. But with Kislev, yeah, the supporter system needs to be thrown in a ditch, lit on fire, and the ashes scattered to the four winds and never talked about again. It wasn't necessarily a great system in Troy, though Troy felt a lot more rewarding. But it is a horrible system that severely limits your campaign. And when you're limiting Confederation, for instance, when you're taking away baseline features like Confederation to implement a gimmicky system, that's when things, come crashing down. But one of the issues with Kislev, and the reason I'm using it as an example, Kislev is the poster child of how a race can have a very powerful unit roster, and yet their campaigns can feel bad. Like, Kislev has good magic, they have good replenishment, they can get good Autoresolve with a lot of their units. Their power on battlefield. The only problem they have with their unit roster is they have no artillery until they get it to Tier 4, which makes sieges not a particularly fun experience, especially as you don't have the melee that can just rush into a settlement and just kill everything in sight. I mean, armored Kossars get the job done, but they're better in a formation on the field, supported by regular Kossars, Streltsy, and Akshina. They're not the kind of unit that you just want to rely on solo. And that is a bit of a problem. So yeah, one of the things that I would say, everyone needs some siege option at Tier 2. At the very least, right? It doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be like a cannon for everyone or anything like that. But there should be a viable, good siege option that breaks down freaking walls available at Tier 2 for every single race in the game. Could be, some massive chaos giant that's dedicated for that role. I mean, Ogres, one of the things that makes Ogres work is they have Wall Breaker. Spread that around more, CA. It's an awesome ability, just as an example. So that's one thing, but a really key issue I want to highlight with Kislev, and this does apply to the Demon Prince, this does apply to Tsinch and others, is the limited economy. So you're spending 1,000 gold for 100 income on this. That is freaking awful. And you have 5 different freaking tiers on this. And obviously the highest tiers are going to require you to you're only going to be able to do it in provincial capital. It feels so unfulfilling to play a Kislev campaign, because yes, the early game can be a freaking nightmare fighting, fighting Trog, Fraught, even though Malachi does help with that, but Azazel and Fraught are your problems. Then Archeon and other issues, and over here, you get Azag as Katrin, Drycha as Katrin, Vlad, all those kind of problems that do rear their head. That can be fun. But the problem is, you build a massive empire, you conquer a lot of territory in the process, you build a massive empire, and then you realize all the gold you're getting, you're just spending it into more structures that are going to take 10 plus turns, if not 20 plus turns, to make their return on investment. This is why having at least a decent economy, I'm not talking great, not everyone has to be Cafe or the High Elves or Dark Elves really, but having at least a decent economy is important. Kislev does not have a decent economy, they have genuinely one of the worst, and they're not alone in this. There are other races. There are ways of making this work, right? Like, you think of the Skaven. The Skaven have a great economy, but it's reliant on you controlling a lot of regions, and it's reliant on you having multiple structures with an income modifier, and thus you primarily benefit in a Skaven campaign from having provinces with like 3-4 settlements in them for that income modifier. Like provinces with 2 settlements, now really worth 1 or 2 settlements, not worth it, though you can use them for food generation if you want to, because there's a commandment on that subject. Still, right, there are ways of balancing things out, but you do need at least some kind of decent level of income so that you can compete with other races that do have much higher income. And it's not just that. I've played many Kislev campaigns in Warhammer 3, and I can tell you, almost every single time, you got a really horrible palace like turn 60 because, again, that limited economy rears its head. It's not particularly hard if you know what you're doing. You can eliminate the Azazel Escastalton fairly quickly, for instance. But it's just like the payoff of it is not great. Now, it's better when Norska being mountain and frozen climate, but that's something else we gotta talk about. Freaking climate limitations. The climate in this game is such a rope around your neck. It ruins so many campaigns in the game because it's like, oh, you don't have the great climate, you're gonna get screwed. There needs to be a better system of that. I understand the intent of the climate system. I don't mind it inherently, but I think CA needs to worry about like how do various campaigns work, because there is a significant imbalance in the way climate works in a campaign. And just using the Kislev example, Castalton and Cautrin are far worse than Boris Ursus simply because he has one additional climate in the Wasteland, and he does better with Cast Wasteland as well. But he has the Wasteland, which means he can take the entire Darklands, like all of the territory from the coast of freaking Bretonia to the southern tip of the mountains of Morn is viable climate for Boris. It's not for Catrin and Castalton, so that gives him a huge amount of power and a lot more flexibility in his campaign than what Catrin or Castalton have to deal with. Astanka also has that benefit, though she has some inherent issues as well. So that should not be a situation, because if you create a situation where one lord has an additional climate than others, but they're all playing the same campaign or want to play the same campaign, a particular example of this freaking situation is the High Elves and Ulfan. Going to Ulfan as any High Elven campaign, even as a Leafanar, is always freaking worth it. But what happens when climate ends up limiting your potential beyond that? That is a problem. Also in Grom's campaign, so they need to be a bit more clever on that. That's all I had to say. Christine signing out. Obviously, there's a lot more issues to talk about. Let me know what you guys think, what specific problems you guys would like to see addressed, because, hey, CA said that they're listening. We'll see how much they listen and what kind of feedback they're listening to at the end of the day. Stay tuned for more.